What's going on everybody, Cryo here, and as promised, here is my video on how I personally like to tank the other side. These videos will be longer than my mechanics pull by pulls, but a lot of you have asked that I do not cut out trash packs because seeing how I handle them helps you. So without further ado, let's get it. As stated before, this particular route does not change drastically week to week. The route allows you to line up Prideful for every boss except the final one, which is extremely useful on tyrannical weeks, but also cuts a significant amount of time off your fortified runs. Much like the other dungeons this season, finding different optimal routes for the other side can prove challenging. The dungeon itself has certain aspects about it that do not allow the skipping of trash to be reasonable. Now, I'm not saying you can't skip trash ever, but realistically there is only one section of the dungeon where this won't come back to haunt you. This first pull may seem scary and you can opt into using Bloodlust or Heroism to make quick work of it. However, depending on your group's DPS and cooldown management, you may not have it back up for Hakar on tyrannical weeks. The second pull is, in my opinion, a bit more challenging. There is a lot going on here, and from a tank's perspective, things can get a bit spicy. First off, we have a Death Speaker in the pack. These deal a decent amount of magic damage to the tank, but also have the ability to knock players off the platform. Secondly, there are 6 mobs that melee for a good chunk, so now you're mitigating both kinds of damage in rapid succession. Plan your cooldowns accordingly and coordinate with your healer if at all possible. Aside from inspiring weeks, this is a perfect pack of mobs to practice your kiting and interrupting skills. If you are using voice, communicate that at least one DPS player should save their big cooldowns for this pack. Do not head up to the Zul'Gurub wing just yet. The reason we pull a bit more and backtrack later is entirely for prideful percentages. Up next we have the Enraged Spirit. Even on tyrannical weeks, this guy slaps. Luckily, for the first one, groups that have a Night Fae representative can use the urn in order to stun the spirit during its rage cast. Other than that, stack up and help your healers out. Pulling the Bone Soldier and the Raptors will spawn our first Prideful. This works out perfectly because the next pull is a double Warlord pack. These mobs hurt. Double on Fortified, and even more so if you do not have access to a Soothe, Shiv, or Trank shot. Having the Prideful buff here allows your healer to pump without concerns for mana, your tank to kite with the added speed boost, and your DPS to annihilate the pack with the damage increase. Once they are dealt with, we can make our way back up to Zul'Gurub. This hallway is pretty straightforward. Split it up into as many pulls as you need and coordinate interrupts and stuns. Fun fact, if you are a Blood or Frost Death Knight, I highly recommend controlling one of the Deathwalkers. They deal an insane amount of AoE damage with their Blade Storm, which is essentially free DPS for you. You will have to release it in order to open the door to the boss and spawn Prideful. Again, if you have a Night Fae representative, make good use of this urn. There are so many different variations of this pull, and you should practice one with your group to become more efficient. But if you are pugging or not using voice, just be sure to tank the mobs near the urn and you might get lucky. I will say, do not make the mistake of assuming a player is going to click the urn and try to double pull. This will likely end in a wipe, and group frustration levels will be high before the first boss, increasing the chances someone will leave. Take your time and pull smart. Kiting in this hallway can be a bit tricky due to the hoodoo hexers, but do your best and do not forget you can use LOS to interrupt some casts. This particular group was cruising through trash packs, and we did not have Bloodlust up for the start of the Hakar encounter, but we still used it as soon as possible. Hakar on Tyrannical is rough. The only advice I can give is to hard swap to adds to avoid large blood shields. Keep in mind, the adds are susceptible to CC, and it is highly recommended you do so to keep their AoE damage low. Once Hakar is defeated, start making your way back to Mechagon. I like to try and pull the lone headless client with the dental drill, but again, all of these pulls can be split up to fit your group's needs. I prefer using the pipe here to LOS the haywire, as it's a shorter run back and allows melee DPS to get back into the action ASAP, but user preference. Headless clients are not much of a threat to tanks unless you are standing on top of them during spinning up, so pulling them with the dog is not too far-fetched. This is a lot of damage on fortified weeks, however, so I may opt into splitting this up. All depends on my group's composition and available CDs. The rest of the wing is pretty straightforward. If your group can handle more than one lubricator at a time, go for it. This can save you some seconds, but they fall over pretty quickly regardless. Engineers here are also a big help on cutting down silly mistakes. Now these sentient oil mobs can be one of the scariest pulls in the whole dungeon. If they target the same person on a fortified week, they can and will one-shot them. Interrupt, stun, displace, literally do everything in your power to prevent their cast from going off. Keep in mind this is a prideful pull, so manage your health and mana accordingly. The mana storms can be a tricky fight, but as long as players understand the basic mechanics, it should fall over. The biggest piece of advice I have for this fight: do not push Millhouse too quickly. You want him around in order to stun Millie. If you push him too fast, he will not cast Shadow Fury and you will have no way of stopping Maleficent's aerial rocket barrage, thus making your healer cry. You should have a decent amount of time left on the Prideful buff going into this pull, and that should be enough to push Millhouse to a decent percent before he leaves the arena. If available, use Bloodlust on Maleficent. Drop every single Shadow Fury you can on her, and click bombs ASAP. As a tank, you can spam click as she's summoning the squirrel bombs, and if you are lucky, you will channel the disarm before they even make it out of melee range, allowing your group to focus on DPS and healing. Once the bosses are finished, make your way towards Ardenweald. You will have to face one more Enraged Spirit, and this time without an urn. This will be a significant amount of damage, so do not be afraid to use cooldown. This is a perfect time to use health pots and health stones if available. This was on Tyrannical. You can imagine what it looks like on fortified weeks. So this pull has a few different options. Being a Blood DK, I opted into controlling the inspired mob, voiding the affix completely. This allows the group to interrupt the range mobs, which makes stacking them for the urn explosion much easier. Another way is to CC the inspired mob and then use the stairs to LOS the casters. They will naturally follow your group and walk out of the inspirer's range. If you do not have a Night Fae, pull what your group can handle. This next pull is a doozy, but if you have good control and understand kiting, it's really fun. There is nothing to interrupt here, but we still opt to CC the inspired mob to allow spells like Binding Shot and Frost Nova to have an effect, making it much easier for me to kite. Groups should focus down the Runestag Elderhorn since it is not affected by roots and snares. Now this pull will spawn Prideful, and how your group uses it can make or break this key. Ideally, you will have a Night Fae that can trigger the last urn, allowing for a large pull. If you are unlucky or uncoordinated, just be sure to pull safely and quickly. You do not want to waste the buff. Now here is a perfect example of where I fell too far behind and did not kite fast enough. Knowing that there was an inspired mob in the pack, I should have stunned it and started to create some distance ahead of time, allowing the other mobs to be snared. This would have staggered some of my necrotic stacks and I would not have died. Fortunately, the mobs were really low and the group was fairly mobile, so kiting for them was easy, saving the full team wipe. Now after Prideful, if you have access to the urn, your pull will look something like this on most weeks. Sanguine and bolstering weeks may look slightly different. The bird that I death grip here needs to be grabbed. If you are using the urn and do not grab it, it will be stunned regardless and then aggro anyways. Best to have it in for the cleave. Now this pull can be scary at first for most tanks, so using a CD or two is advised. As long as everyone's on the same page, it's easily handled. You should use this stun time to catch back up and start planning your next route of escape. As you see here, I just turn tail and run, but be careful not to pull extra while kiting. You can either pull these Spriggans or the ones at the end of the path just before Zayaxa. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is stopping the Bladebeak hatchling from casting frightening cries. We do not wish to pull extra birds here, so stopping this is of the highest priority. Most weeks, I prefer to skip the Matriarch. You can pull all of the territorial Bladebeaks without aggroing the Matriarch, and I do this because of the significant health difference. Fighting the Matriarch takes so much time and it's not worth it. Again, I got a little too eager and our group did not have the right CDs available to pull off this pack with the Inspiring. Not being able to kite is a huge deal for Blood DKs, and if I were any other tank, getting out of this mess would have been significantly easier, but that doesn't negate the fact that it was a silly, over-enthusiastic pull. Looking back, I would have just dealt with the Bladebeaks first, and or waited for Wild Spirits to be off cooldown. Our final trash pull will spawn our last Prideful mob, just in time for Dealer Zayaxa. Even on fortified weeks, getting done with this boss as soon as possible is very appealing. Regardless of your composition, as your key level increases, spreading out the damage caused by arcane lightning becomes more significant. Be sure to bounce it around to healthy players and do not let one player take too many stacks. The rest of the fight is pretty self-explanatory. One last note, try to drag the boss towards the entrance just before you finish the fight. If you spam click fast enough, you can start taking the transport before the RP goes off. Alas, we have made it to Mazala. Thankfully, Blizzard did seem to fix the evil cloud bug during this fight, which we are grateful for. It is still best practices to split up DPS and try to defeat all Totem Guardians in one phase. At higher difficulties, and especially on tyrannical weeks, the healer tank combo may struggle to get their totem down, so 2-phasing becomes more likely. This is fine, but it does mean fewer mistakes can be made throughout the rest of the run. Our group had fairly decent DPS, and with tyrannical, 2-phasing took about 4 minutes. So do not be discouraged if you fail to kill a totem or two, you should have plenty of time if the rest of the run was smooth. A note to healers and tanks. Soul Crusher is a physical dot that deals less damage the more you mitigate it before it hits you. I often see spells like Ironbark being used after its application, which will help the tank sustain the dot, but if you cast it or any other DRs before the spell hits, the dot will be significantly less, making it less of an oh crap moment. As a DK, you can AMS the dot, but it seems you still take a hit from the actual attack. Just keep an eye on the timer and mitigate it as best you can. But that's all I have for the other side. As always, I hope you learned something that will make your next Mythic Plus more of a success. I appreciate you guys sticking around and watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay frosty.